What happens when you take the eventual director of My Cousin Vinny and pair it with the writer of the Blues Brothers, and then throw in an ensemble cast featuring Christopher Lloyd, Martin Mull, Michael McKean, Madeline Kahn, and Tim Curry, amongst others? Well, apparently you don't make any money, at least not until years later. Putting all of those together gets you Clue, which was released on December 13th in 1985 by Paramount. You'd think that with all that star power put together, a madcap comedy released in the holiday season would be a no-brainer to be successful, but no, apparently audiences didn't agree, and Clue only made back $14.6 million out of its $15 million budget during its original release. Apparently audiences, preferred the stylings of Spies Like Us, The Jewel of the Nile, and a true box office heavyweight in Rocky IV that month, and I probably shouldn't even mention that it was even outsold in December by a re-release of Disney's 101 Dalmatians that actually came out a week later. Thankfully for all of us, cable TV, home video, and now streaming are a thing, and Clue has since developed a cult classic status, as it should, being a hilarious, well-written movie that was specifically designed to keep audiences guessing. But I think Clue's lack of success originally wasn't just due to its, competition at the time. Don't get me wrong, there were plenty of other quality reasons to go to the theaters in December. I didn't even mention two little films called Out of Africa and The Color Purple that, you might have heard of. But I think the bigger problem is it's simply hard to make a movie about a licensed property and get people to care about it, even if it's done well. Especially for a board game like Clue, where the board game itself is so iconic it's almost hard to imagine it in any other form. However, I should probably pause for a second because, I'm sure there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now confused because, this is a video game review channel and, I've spent the entire time so far talking about movies. Well, don't worry, it'll make sense in a second. Certainly more than releasing a movie where you'd get a different ending depending on which theater you went to. And, now I'm beginning to understand maybe why I didn't do so well originally. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Today's game, like the movie, is an adaptation of the board game Clue, with the Genesis version releasing exclusively in North America in December of 1992. In fact, both the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions were only physically available in North America, although the Genesis version did show up in other areas of the world via the Sega channel. I'm going to assume that this is related to Parker Brothers, publisher of the video game, only being the North American publisher of the board game, while at the time, the actual game itself was the property of British game manufacturer Waddington's, which might be the most British name of a company that I've ever heard. Clue isn't quite as old as board games like Monopoly or Battleship, but it had been part of pop culture for over 40 years by the time the Genesis version was released, so the developers at Sculptured Software more than likely grew up playing the game before working on the digital version. So did that potential familiarity with the material allow Sculptured Software to deliver a competent version of the classic game? Or did this turn out to be more of a quick license cash grab on Parker Brothers' part, much like Risk, also developed by Sculptured Software and reviewed way back in episode 3. Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package.
And here's my copy of Clue for the Genesis. It's in pretty decent shape. The outer cover is completely intact, except for a few small marks here and there, and even though the hang tab was removed at the top, it was done in just about as clean a manner as I've seen while doing the channel. The inner cover's in likewise decent shape, with no edgeware or water damage anywhere, and about the only thing that I can see is some very light sun bleaching, that on its own is tough to pick out due to the light nature of the artwork, but shows up more when you compare it to the manual. Of note, Clue is one of those games that Ballistic, aka Accolade, picked up the rights to re-release later in the console's lifespan, so technically there's both the clamshell and cardboard box versions of Clue floating around out there, which can be seen here. Why do I have two copies of Clue, you might ask? Well, apparently I wasn't paying attention when I originally bought it, and the first cartridge was clearly a formal rental copy, which looks like this. Yeah, oops. Thankfully, due to how available the game is, with both the original and re-release versions, I was able to pick up a second copy pretty easily this week to get a label upgrade, hence the 2 copies. I paid about $15 for that second copy, and honestly, had I waited, I probably could have found it for only $10, but I wanted to make sure I had it in time for doing the video. As far as the front cover goes, I think this is pretty solid. Essentially what Parker Brothers did here was they took the version of the board game that was for sale in 1992 and used the same background, logo, and a cropped version of the box artwork to create the cover. Also, researching this is how I found out that there's an entire fandom wiki dedicated to just Clue, which I've got to admit is somewhat terrifying. But if I'm being honest, I probably also shouldn't be surprised. The Super Nintendo version is able to have a mostly uncropped version of the artwork due to their landscape formatting for their boxes, but I think I still prefer the Genesis version. Apologies to Professor Plum and Mrs. Peacock. Flipping over the back end, we've got an interesting layout with 3 pretty decent quality screenshots, but I've got to be honest, even with the nice quality of screenshots, the game doesn't necessarily look good. Granted, it's understood that this is a licensed video game based on a board game, so anyone picking it up would probably need to be reasonable in their expectations for how it will look and sound, but the screenshots they picked aren't exactly doing them any favors. Except the first one, the disembodied hand with the game board in the background is kinda cool. Along with the screenshots, there's solid flavor text laying out the game, and I don't really have any notes there. Ultimately, I think the outer packaging did as good a job as it probably could have, given the source material. Opening up the package, and you can now see the replacement cartridge with the intact label, but also the original manual. You can tell this because the manual with the ballistic version, even though it has the same full-color cover, still has the cheaper Xeroxed paper on the inside, and only 1 sample checklist sheet as opposed to the original manual being on better paper and having more checklist sheets. Those checklist sheets are nice to have, and while in 2025 you don't really need them, you can probably just download them from the internet or something. At the time, it certainly made the manual worth having, amongst other things, like the background information about Clue itself and each of the characters. Okay, that's the package, or packages, I guess. Let's try to figure out who killed Mr. Body, Daly, for 40 years. See, it says it right there in the manual. I'm not making that up. Before we start the review, I should probably go over some background information about Clue the board game, in case you're not familiar with it. Or for some bizarre reason you call it Cluedo instead of Clue, and you're wondering why the name is wrong. As mentioned, Clue the board game has some pedigree, with it being invented by the British game designer Anthony Pratt as something to do during World War II while trying to avoid bombs being dropped on his head. While I joke about the Cluedo name because it sounds completely bizarre in North American parlance, Cluedo was its original name, with it being some sort of play on words between Clue and another popular board game at the time, Ludo, which in and of itself was just a version of Sorry, aka Parcheesi. As an American, when it's explained that way, I understand how they came up with the name, but it still doesn't really make any sense because other than both Clue and Ludo being board games, they really share nothing in common. Naming nonsense aside, whatever you call it, Clue was a hit, specifically because it wasn't just a board game. You weren't just rolling dice and going to random spots on a board to try to collect money or answer trivia questions. There was an actual mission you were trying to accomplish, namely to try to figure out who committed a murder, where, and how. Looking at board games in 2025, I honestly think that Clue is a major forerunner for the more complicated types of games that we have now, with not just the mystery/horror theme, but also just how the game is played, with the goal of not being any specific destination or dollar amount. Sure, there's not really any role-playing involved, unless you want there to be, but you can definitely see how the design of the game would lead to that sort of thing. So I guess the first question we have to answer is, just how good of a job did Sculptured Software do at translating Clue from a popular board game to a video game? Did they create something that would make players want to play a video game version of Clue rather than the tried and true board game? And I don't want to just nuke the game right away, but there's definitely some issues that I see when playing the game in digital form. To back up for a second, when playing the board game version of Clue, it's relatively simple. You have 3 sets of cards, one for each room, one for each weapon, and one for each person. At the beginning of the game, someone picks one of each card at random and places them into an envelope without looking at them. Then the remaining cards are dealt to the players. One by one, players go around making suggestions of who did it where and how, but they have to be in the room that they're making the suggestion of, hence the board portion of the game. When they make the suggestion, players then go around to the left, and if they have one of the cards in the suggestion, they'll show it to that first player only, so they'll know that it's disproved. This goes on until someone decides that they have enough evidence of what happened that they make an official accusation, and either they're right and they win, or they're wrong and they lose the game, but then still have to participate in suggestions until someone figures it out. It's pretty simple to pick up and play, which is probably part of what made it so popular. Unfortunately, this doesn't work so well with multiple players having to share the same screen, amongst other issues. So Sculptured Software decided that rather than do a completely straight port of the game, they would tweak things a bit. At the beginning of the game and on each turn, every player can look at their cards, so they can know at least very certain things to rule out. The manual specifically states that for other players to look away from the screen when this is occurring to prevent cheating. And that's all well and good, and if you only needed to look at your cards 1 or 2 times a game, it wouldn't be a big deal. The problem is when you would normally have to go around and tell people that you had evidence that something didn't happen, but only tell that one person what the evidence is. To keep the computer in control of things instead, rather than risking players cheating or making mistakes, Sculptured Software went in a slightly different direction and turned the game into more of a logic problem, rather than simple process of elimination. Players still have to move around the board to the various rooms before they can submit a suggestion that involves that room, but the responses to the suggestions work a bit differently. Rather than one player say, "That couldn't have happened because I have X card," you'll instead be presented with various clues based on your suggestion. For instance, in the easier difficulty levels, if you suggest that it was Mr. Green in the kitchen with the revolver, the game will either confirm if one of those is true, i.e. Mr. Green was in the kitchen or the revolver was in the kitchen, or if none of it was true. It'll give you some sort of other declarative statement like Mr. Green was in the library or the revolver was in the billiards room, or even better yet, that no one had the revolver, allowing everyone to cross off the revolver completely. I mentioned difficulty levels there, and the game does feature 5 of them. And you might be wondering, well, how on earth would difficulty levels work in a board game? It's not like you can play Monopoly in hard mode, although I suppose you could start with less money. Anyway, what this means for Clue is that since the game has been turned into a logic problem to solve, the higher difficulty levels instead tend to tell you that something is not true, rather than that something is true. Now, keep in mind that if you do the math of all the different options of who did what and where, you end up with 324 different scenarios. What ends up happening then, especially in the hardest difficulty mode, is that essentially each turn you're crossing off one of those 324 scenarios. Now, granted, eventually the game will give you a break and give you a positive statement instead, and eventually you'll cross off enough options that if you follow the logic that you can rule things out, but this becomes a miserable, slow experience, and the one game that I played in this manner, while taking notes every turn, it still ended up taking about 45 minutes. Now, I grew up working logic problems. This was something I picked up from my dad, who, rather than crossword puzzles or word finds, he would pick up activity magazines filled with either logic problems or acrostics instead. So I've got a long history with them. However, usually logic problems are better written, with a set of clever statements that you then have to compare and contrast to each other to rule things out, or rule for certain things. You're not just going down a list and crossing off a lot of small things over and over again. Worse yet, if you're playing the computer is going to be making all of the very same notes that you are. So chances are everyone is going to come to the same conclusion at the same time, meaning that the only way to win is to get lucky, and either you guess the right combination before anyone else does, or you just happen to have your turn come next when the last piece of information that's needed to isolate who did what where comes up. Granted, if you're only playing against humans and not the computer, it's not necessarily a concern, but if you're playing against other human players that aren't stupid, well, you probably will run into the same problem. Worse yet, this week when I was doing research on the game, I ran across a guide that was written for the Super Nintendo version of the game, and I want to credit author of the guide, Zack P1, for this information. But apparently, to keep the ROM size of the game down, the Super Nintendo version doesn't support each of the 324 different scenarios playing out, which allowed sculptured software to not have to draw every character in every area with every weapon. Being that Sculptured Software developed both versions of the game and that they look fairly identical, I'm going to assume that the Genesis version has the same limitation, which results in there actually only being about 30, not 324 scenarios. To me, that's just not acceptable, especially due to the fact that the game shipped on a 4 megabit cartridge, small by late 1992 standards, and I'm not even sure that the full 4 megabits was used, for reasons I'll get to in a minute. The whole point is, if you're going to change fundamentally how Clue works to make it work as a video game, you can't also cut out 90% of the possibilities. The whole thing just reeks of poor design. As far as the graphics are concerned, they're fine, I guess. I've certainly seen worse, and I do like how both the actual board game is presented on the screen and how each of the characters are drawn, emulating their looks from the 1992 version of the game, just like the cover artwork. And to be fair, this is a board game adaptation. I shouldn't be expecting some sort of crazily animated treasure action game. But even with that said, I think I would have liked to have seen more. I mean, I get that they wouldn't want to show, like, say, the actual killing of Mr. Body, that makes sense. But other than stuff like the disembodied dice rolling hand or the curtains that go up and down when other scenarios are presented, the game features almost zero actual animation. It's all based around static screens for the most part. It definitely seems like they did the bare minimum to get the job done while not looking terrible. And this is certainly not a title that you're going to ever use to show off the processing power of the Genesis. The sound is more or less in the same boat. There's a few different musical tracks that play as you play the game, and none of them sound bad specifically, but also no one is going to be clamoring for Data to release the soundtrack on vinyl anytime soon. To their credit, I do like how each of the 6 characters had their own theme to match with their characters. For instance, Colonel Mustard having a very patriotic military-sounding theme, so clearly some effort went into the soundtrack. But Clue is also a game that it's going to be quiet for long periods of time when people are just moving around the board and suggestions or accusations aren't being played out. The sound effects are decent, just like the music, but also just like everything else, it's all just enough to get the job done. For instance, there's sound effects for rolling the dice, moving the characters around the board, and a particularly satisfying thud when Mr. Body gets bludgeoned to death, but it's all very functional rather than being particularly stylish. It was nice playing Clue this week for the channel because I had honestly forgotten how the board game worked due to how long it had been since I played it. And going over that made me realize just how clever the game is for it being so simple. Sure, I could see the standard version getting old after a few plays because, you're basically doing the same thing over and over again, but I mean, you can say that about pretty much any board game. But looking at the board game versus the Genesis version made me realize that this is one of those games that really should just be a board game, unless maybe you're playing some multiplayer version where everyone has their own screen, which would allow it to be played with standard rules, versus what they tried to do with the Genesis version. Also, I know the developers tried to cover for the notepad by printing samples in the manual, and it's a nice effort, but that also just reinforces how the game feels better to be played with actual tactile physical items. I ended up just taking notes on my phone while playing, and while it worked, it was definitely a hot mess, especially in the harder difficulties. As a result, I'm giving Clue 1 star, but with a caveat. From an actual game perspective, I can't really say anything about the game is bad. The graphics and sound are both mediocre, but fine, and the game plays out exactly as you would expect. So, if the board game didn't exist, I would probably give it 2 stars. But it does, and its existence just reinforces how this seems like more of a money grab than anything else, hence the single star.
And that's it for Clue for the Genesis. There's not many games on the channel where I've had to buy 2 copies of the game for a review, but thankfully most of them were cheap enough to where it wasn't a big deal to make sure that the video was done properly. But, I guess that makes sense also. The cheaper games are going to be the ones where, I might not be paying full attention when I go to buy them. In this case, though, now I'm left with an extra copy of Clue that I don't need. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to give this one away, but not now, at the end of the year. So keep an eye out for that, and maybe you'll end up with some Clue for the holidays. Next time on the channel, I'm going to do something that I haven't done in the previous 38 reviews from this season, and tackle a game for the poor, misunderstood console add-on, the 32X. It's a game from this little-known developer that would go on to create some games that you may have heard of, small titles like Diablo and Warcraft that, surely haven't had multiple massive sequels, add-ons, and even movies over the years. But this is a game from before all that sadly had been all but forgotten about until, it appeared on a collection for modern consoles back in 2021. I'll be playing it for the first time for this review, so I'm very curious to see if Blizzard should have revisited it at some point over the last 30 years, or if it's, somewhat deserving of its seemingly black sheep status in their catalog. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 303. If you like what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.